Thank you for welcoming us onto your headphones. I'm Eddie.
And I'm Alex, reviewing 1917, and this is the RollBack.
All right, 1917. I think you liked it more than me.
I think that's safe to say. I'm a fairly tough grader as far as these things go. I like to really get into film and see exactly what choices were made and what could have been better. I gave it an A. I thought that there was a lot of really good consideration in the filmmaking here. I appreciated the choices that were made a lot. You're feeling less warm on it. Can you tell us a little bit about your main objections?
I don't think it's so much I have objections, mate. I think it's just more like I feel like this film was more of an art piece than an actual film. I don't know. It was just a really good story, but I only take it at face value as a story. The cinematography is beautiful. Like, I can't argue that. And I even told you the score, was haunting. I can't review it on paper. I can only talk about it. I don't know how to analyze it or break it down.
I see we're covering up laziness here because only one of us has written a review, huh?
Yeah, no, I can't fucking write a review on this, man. I just can't do it.
Well, and that almost surprises me to hear a little bit because you're the one who mentioned the score. I think I talked about that a little bit in my review, more just sound design. Other than the song at the end, the music didn't really call my attention.
At no other point in the film?
I really couldn't say. It was always more about the actual sounds that were happening, right? So when they're going through no man's land, or the gunshots, the bunker explosion, all of those, I thought sound design was really great. But the music, it just, I don't know. I guess it was effective in that it set the scenes and I didn't think about it too much. It was more of a support for me.
That's fair. I guess we'll start from the beginning. I don't know about you, but I always whenever I'm watching a movie, I assign characters personally, and there were two soldiers here, so immediately I was like, oh, that guy's me, that guy's Alex.
Yeah, that's an easy comparison to make, given that you have kind of one of the classic odd couple pairings. You have a guy who's kind of younger, who's kind of more idealistic, really wants to go forward, very impassioned. And then you have, the older guy. He's a little more cynical because he's seen a bit more, very cautious sort. He wants to get out of this alive, definitely. And I think that our approaches do kind of sync up to those two.
I remember at one point, didn't the older gentleman, the older one, what was his name? It was...
that is Schofield, William Schofield.
William Schofield. Didn't Will... there was a funny story that I thought, not funny, but he traded his medal for a bottle of wine because he was thirsty.
And not only that, but this is his medal from the Somme. The Somme, for you non-history buffs out there, one of the most famous battles of World War I. Incredibly bloody business. I mean, all of World War I was, right? But the Somme is a sort of special chapter. And to have gone through all of that, survived it, and then to give up the medal, I think that's Sam Mendes really telling us what the war has done to this character and how he views the war.
So you think the whole point of the odd couple pairing was just to kind of show, the before and after effects of such a bloody conflict? Because the other guy, not Schofield, what was the other one?
Blake. That's
Blake.
Tom Blake.
Tom Blake. So he's very innocent, I think, from all this. He's new, relatively, isn't he?
He is. We know that at the very least, he's seen less action than Schofield has, because Schofield at one point very pointedly says that he wasn't there at the battle. He says you weren't there to kind of experience this horror. We know for a fact that he's less seasoned than Schofield is. I wouldn't necessarily call him naive per se. I just think that he's very focused. He hears that his brother is in danger. Family obviously is of incredible importance to him, given how he talks about it. So he, knows that he needs to go save him. And also the fact is that he's not useless in a combat environment. He knows how to, for instance, keep Schofield's spirits up, and he's very brave too, especially during the cave-in scene. I think you see that.
I'm not a claustrophobic person, but that scene made me claustrophobic. Everything just collapsing around them. My immediate thought was, like, fuck this, run. Get the hell out of Dodge.
Exactly. Yeah,
but
to make yourself stay there, to help out your blinded friend.
Yeah, but see, that's a big thing, having the presence of mind to be like, I need to get not just myself, but this my partner out with me. He had the wherewithal, and that's saying something.
Exactly. And I think that with Blake, you see a very compassionate person, and someone who I think is maybe a little inspiring to Schofield. Someone who, kind of impresses upon him the notion that there's something in this war still worth striving for.
Quick question, mate. What did you think of the, when they're walking no man's land and you see the bodies everywhere, you see the depiction of what the First World War was like? Because we've seen so many different video games, so many different films are based off World War II. This is the first time I've ever had a good look at World War I and thought to myself, the carnage. You see bodies like in the wall, like impaled from the explosions.
Yeah, and I mean, you see a hand going through a body at one point. It's definitely a lot of devastation. World War II has definitely gotten a lot more exposure. I want to say that you make the video game comparison there. I think that the only major title that has been released about World War I is Battlefield, and that's compared to how many iterations of Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, all of that. So,
I mean, not to mention the films, like greatest war films. You immediately go to what? Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
I mean, that's World War II incarnate. But even, I don't know if he was able to, but I mean, this film is way, I don't want to say bloodier, but the carnage just seems more realistic, I guess.
Well, I think it's bleaker in a way, because, and one thing that I mentioned in my review is that there's not a whole lot of action set pieces, if you know what I'm saying. There's not a lot of carnage like the first scene of Saving Private Ryan where they hit the beach. It's far more about the after effects. And I think it's also kind of more realistic in its take of war, because if you are, grunt level, you are just a lance corporal and you're alone in enemy territory, you aren't going to see, German soldiers forming up. You aren't going to see, a lot of nice aerial shots to tell you what's happening. It's just going to be you, like Schofield is, alone in the dark as loud sounds and bright lights explode all around you and you don't know exactly what's going on.
Did that scene in the town kind of throw you off a bit in the tempo of the film? Because I thought he was just going to be sneaking around. But, I mean, I don't know. It kind of threw me off that Schofield he almost kind of put himself in a position to have to use force. Because everything leading up until that point, he was avoiding a fight at all costs. Right.
When he's in Ikust. And are you talking about... Because he encounters German soldiers a couple of times in Ikust. The three that come to mind are the bell tower, initially, right, when he's fighting the sniper, where he kind of sees another guy across a courtyard, and they sort of approach each other, and then he has to run away. And then the third was when he chokes the guy.
Yeah, no, the third. So when he chokes the guy out, leading up to that scene, my whole thought process was just go around. I don't know. It almost seems like seemed uncharacteristic of him because he went through the town instead of around it. I don't know if I missed something.
I think that he's kind of forced into that just by the timeline of him getting to the town. So his orders are to cut, straight through Ikust over the bridge, because command did not know that the bridge was down, and then straight over to the Devons, which is the regiment that he has to warn. But I mean, you recall, he fights the sniper, he gets knocked out cold, and by the time that he wakes up, either the Germans have sort of revealed themselves, or the town has become occupied in the, ensuing time.
It's true, I forgot he got knocked out.
Exactly. So he's trying to get out any way that he can. Now, is his route optimal? Probably not. I mean, there's definitely a lot of times where he's running in like a main road rather than like sneaking around buildings. But I think you have to consider two things. The first is that, this guy is not Solid Snake. He's not Special Forces, right? He's not even the primitive version of Special Forces that existed in World War One. He's one of two couriers who's now in a full-on combat situation. And I believe at that point he's also lost his weapon, and he's definitely lost most of his equipment after having given it to I believe Lori was. The other factor that's weighing on his mind is the fact of how much time that he has lost. The sun is coming up. His friend is dead, and he's got to get out of this town. I think that those two things kind of combined, panic and then also knowing where he has to go, I think that's what gives you the kind of hectic chase.
What to you seemingly was like a big standout moment for you that kind of grounded the film?
I think that one thing that really surprised me was the death of Blake. I had figured that, it was possible one of the two might die. And there's, a couple of ways that you could go with it. You could have them, kill Schofield, kill the older veteran, to show that, in some ways he can't really ever escape the war, right? He sacrifices himself to give Blake a fighting chance, etc. There's a lot of ways you can do that in a film. But for the fact that they killed Blake and that they killed him so early as well, because this is mostly a solo film, that did surprise me. That made me kind of take another look. And what about you? What's kind of a standout moment here?
God, there's two. Obviously, his death. I didn't think they were going to kill him so quickly early on either. Genuinely, I figured one of them was going to die, but I thought it would be in like leading into the third act, like into the desperate push. I never noticed, but if you go back and watch the previews, most of the footage is from the first act, because that's when Blake is still alive.
Or from the very end to showcase Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yeah. Because you got that star power, you got to use it.
Of course. It just makes it, it makes you think that he's a part of the film at all, other than like the 3 minutes he was there.
Yeah. Well, also not only that, mate. The scene where Schofield is actually walking across no man's land at the end, running as quickly as he can, running through bombardments of shells, soldiers running, in front of him and behind him, running into battle, dying. These bodies are being flung everywhere. He's running into soldiers. I remember, I think that might have been the only time I laughed in the entire film. The magnitude of it, because that felt a little too real. That looked a little too genuine. Because too often, when you watch films, as many films as I do, you kind of see the CGI, you see the effects. But that scene felt a little too real.
And one of those cracks that you mentioned is very often, for instance, in a fight scene where you don't have stars that are willing to do their own stunts, or they don't have time to really get into the choreography, you'll see a quick cut, right? Someone's about to throw a punch, you cut to the other guy kind of receiving the blow. I think that part of this film's strength is the faux one-take format that they have, because you really can't cut around a lot of the actors in that case. I would be willing to bet that the stumble that you saw was more likely than not real. When you're filming something like this, from everything I understand, it's almost more like you're doing a play, where you have to kind of do everything right the whole way through, instead of saying, oh, we can do another take on that and just get it exactly right. You can mess up as many times as you need.
I mean, I guess you're not wrong, mate. He ledgered it, he improvised, he tripped and fell, he bounced back up, he rolled and kept running forward. No, I guess that did add to the authenticity of it. But you mentioned something I completely forgot about. This whole film was, in fact, kind of shot in a one-take format. Do you think that added to the power of it? Do you think it made it more believable or less? Or
Well, I definitely think that it helps the film's authenticity, just because of what you're mentioning. You don't have that ability to, if someone stumbles, say, let's get another take of that. Because if you do that, then you basically have to rewind the last, hour or so of film. You have to go back all the way to another set, You have to have him, for instance, get knocked out again in a Koost, or have him run through the town all over again. I would expect, anyway, that it would really challenge the actors, as well as, of course, the crew who are setting all of this up, to not only really inhabit their characters, but also to be prepared for any unexpected event that might happen that they have to adapt to. And so I think at that point, you really have to think, well, what would Schofield do if this were to actually happen? Because I can't, ruin this whole day's shoot.
What was that pressure?
I think so. I mean, I would imagine so, particularly given the fact that they definitely did use camera tricks to help with the one-take format, because there are hidden cuts and etc. But I think that for a lot of it, they kind of keep the camera out in the open. They don't go around corners, which is a common trick for a hidden cut. I think that a lot of this was sort of done in that authentic way. Did you find that faux one-take format was distracting at all?
I didn't think it was distracting. I guess yes and no. It wasn't annoying me, but I do remember thinking more than once, I wonder how they shot this, because they've been walking for a while. How much of a pain in the ass was it to clear this much area of set? It was just something I noticed, but bear in mind, because of how film-oriented I am, I try to think of the logistics behind shots. I'll watch a film and I'll think to myself, how the hell did they capture that? Or who worked on the special effects,
Agreed. We could probably classify ourselves fairly comfortably as film geeks, given that it's a weekend and we're recording a film podcast.
The very first episode of a film podcast.
Oh dear. But I had that exact same thought that you did. About 10 to 30 minutes in, I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh, how did they get it over that, muddy pond in no man's land? How did they get the camera through this tight space? But I think to the average person who's just more looking at the visuals and more looking at the plot and the characters, I think that they would probably be less affected by that. And also, I think a credit to the film is the fact that I stopped wondering that after the introduction of the movie, I guess, after the first few scenes.
What issues did you have? Because you've spoken so far very highly of this film. Did you have any issues with it? I mean, were there any negatives? Were there any big notes in your mind that you would think to yourself, I would have done that differently, or I wouldn't have included this shot? Or
Yeah. So one thing that I would say is that killing off Blake early is a sort of double-edged sword for me, because as I mentioned, that's kind of the moment that most surprised me early on. It made me pay a lot of attention to the film, because I knew that this film can kind of take me in places I'm not really expecting to go. But at the same time, I think that you do lose something by having Schofield go it alone. I think that the reason why you would have the odd pairing of characters in the first place is that one can kind of play off the other. They can sort of explain things to each other or talk about events, and that way the audience can get to know where each of them is coming from, what's happening in the story. That's really, when they're in the trenches and in no man's land, that's a tool, right, that Sam Mendes has to communicate to the audience. But he loses that when Blake dies. So I might have pushed that off a bit further, or closer to the middle of the film.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, even that quibble, that note has a caveat, in that I think that Mendes is good at giving other characters a chance to, talk to Schofield. Like, for instance, the soldiers in the truck, or Lori. So they're able to communicate a little bit, and Schofield is able to kind of express in that way.
Most films have that one scene that you don't forget. What to you was that scene?
Oh, goodness. Well, a lot of the end of the film, actually, because of course you have the run, the mad dash to Benedict Cumberbatch's quarters, right? So he can call off the attack. But then also afterwards, when he finally finds Blake's brother, and he's able to, convey everything that's happened in very few lines, because it's a short conversation that they have. And I think that's just how people communicated back then. They were very kind of stoic, not very emotional in how they express. That's sort of a quintessential British thing. Stiff upper lip kind of a thing.
As they say.
No, I mean, that handshake that they have kind of conveys a lot by itself. You know, him slumping down in that tree. I think that a lot of it kind of stays with you. Now, you had mentioned nearer to the beginning of our talk that you thought this was more of an art piece than a regular film. Can you kind of elaborate on that, like what the difference would be in your mind between the two, or like what sets this apart as an art piece over a regular film?
It almost feels wrong to try and give this film a grade for me, or to try and break it down, because it doesn't feel like, and this is a genuine compliment I'm trying to give, it doesn't feel like I'm watching a film. It feels like I'm watching, a real story about a real person. Like I'm witnessing what Schofield is going through, like the actual person. I'm not talking about the actor. I mean like who this individual is as a human being. And it's hard to grade that. It's hard to say, oh, well, I didn't like this part of it, but I like that. It's hard because it feels like as a whole, it's an artistic piece of work. This story, it feels, the world is not on the line. There's no nuclear bomb, there's no briefcase, there's no magical powers or superhero. It's literally two dudes. Message has got to get through to the end. Hey, don't fight. People are going to die. The stakes are low but high, if that makes sense, and it feels more realistic because of that. How do you judge that? I couldn't write a review for this film because I didn't even know where to begin. I was so busy trying to find the damn words. I think it was a gutsy call to kill off Blake so early. In particular, the scene where he dies. That actually pulled my heartstrings quite a bit. He's not like walking it off or being brave and being like, keep going on, find my brother for me, man. Like, no, like he's crying, he's scared, he's freaking out. He's like, I want to go home, I want to see my brother, I want to see my mom. Like he's
confused.
Yeah. Well, also the blood loss, like that's a real thing that happens. During that kind of trauma, you forget, like, oh, what happened to me? Because of that trauma. No, he's a scared kid in the middle of a war zone. And like it hits you, man. That one scene in particular, I've been waiting to talk about. Like, how did it hit you? Like, what did you take away from it?
I absolutely agree with your thoughts on that scene. I think that part of what sells it so effectively is just how awkward Schofield is, because this is not something where he gets stabbed and now it's the death scene. Schofield tries to pack that wouldn't put pressure on that wound. He tries to get him up and tries to do a fireman's carry, to try to get him to help a couple of times, and they fall. They fall twice. Just thinking of how human and relatable that is makes that a very powerful moment in my eyes. I think that, especially because he gets confused about where he is and he has to ask if he's going to be all right, I think that really lets that moment play. In addition, you mentioned the blood loss. I don't know how they did this, but you can see that happen. He becomes noticeably paler as the scene goes on.
Oh, no, that's After Effects, mate. Like, no, you can edit. I mean, they could have made him turn orange for all we care.
Oh, that's fair. I hadn't considered. See, that's how in the one take format I am. I hadn't considered it. Like, oh yeah, of course it's CGI. How do you forget that?
If they can make Robert Downey Jr. look 20 again, they can make him look a little white for blood loss.
They only kind of made him look 20 again, though. That was very smooth skin.
Dude, we're young. We have smooth skin.
You speak for yourself, sir. But one thing. One thing that your talk about the stakes of the film reminded me of is how, it's very high, right? It's 1,600 men, but it's also relatable. It makes me think that one of my favorite action sequences, or not even a sequence, it's one part of a sequence in a film is, I believe it's Civil War, where they're having that fight. The Avengers are having a fight in Africa. They're attacking like a facility. And one of the things that Captain America does, other than throwing his mighty shield, he kicks a truck into a guy. And this isn't like a Superman type thing. He doesn't toss the truck or anything. He kicks it, and the truck moves maybe half a foot and hits a guy on the other side. Because it's very relatable. Being where we are, there's trucks every day that we see. You know pretty much exactly how heavy that truck is, right? So when you see it move that much, it has a real weight to it. It's very relatable because it's something that you see every day. And I think that similarly, the stakes of this film are something that a lot of people can relate to. there's a lot of consideration when it comes to directing, because you're in charge of these dozens of people over many months creating this project. So I think that, there's some definite symbolism there. There's parallels in the movie. For instance, one of the ones I point out in my review is at the beginning when they're in the trench, Blake steps over a lump and someone has to tell him, those are bodies, you're stepping on the dead. And then later, when Schofield's in the river and he has to climb out, there are these bloated corpses. And that's another great effect that I want to call attention to. Those bloated bodies, they look fantastic in my opinion.
That's true.
But he has to kind of crawl and step on them too. So there's a parallel from the beginning to the end.
Do you think Mendes is almost trying to make a point of like those who live have to crawl over the bodies of the dead to get out?
I think for this particular war, that's very true. There's still unexploded ordnance from World War I in Europe right now. France has,
really?
I believe, they have, I believe what they call the red zone, where it's just a whole section of their country that they have sort of mapped off because so many millions of shells are in there, not all of them detonated, and it's still very dangerous.
Do they have teams to go and clear those bastards out?
That I don't know. I wouldn't think so, honestly, though, because from what I understand, like modern EOD practices are that when you have something that's a dud, you don't try to like defuse it, you just try to blow it up. Yeah. So I think they just have that kind of walled off. But there's that. There's also the parallel from the very beginning to the very end. At the start, they're both against trees at the kind of edge of a field, and that's exactly where Schofield goes and takes a rest. Different tree, different field, and he's a much different person, but he sort of ended up in the same place where he started in a way. There's, of course, the dialogue about the cherry trees, and how Mendes chooses to include that to remind, I think, the audience that even despite all this carnage, there's still some hope.
Do you think, because overall the film lasts, 2 days in the life of Schofield?
I think so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that is too. I mean, maybe one full day and then the morning of another.
Do you think this film overall, and again, I'm talking about a fictional character at some point.
Of course.
Do you think this film, like these 2 days, are just another 2 days in his life story? But I don't think that this is the apex of his life.
Well, as to the last point, I mean, I think the answer is no. Just because I think this is a really uncommon mission. Particularly given that the trenches on the German side had been unoccupied for the first time in several years. I think that there were a couple of things that made this mission unique. But as to whether, a week from then he would still be in battle, I would say, yeah, probably. 1917 is not the end of the war. I think you have to look at Schofield's background and what we know about him in the movie, which is that he was in the Somme, and whatever he saw there was enough to make him trade that medal away for booze, right? A depressant, something to help you forget, maybe.
True.
I think that this is not the first time that he's seen a lot of carnage. I don't think this is the first time that he's seen action. He seems to handle himself fairly well with that rifle. He seems to be a very cautious individual in hazardous environments. But I do think that this was kind of notable for him. I don't think that it's necessarily the apex, like you mentioned, but I think that this is one of, war stories that will be.
Okay. What did you think of, because you examined a lot about the story and some scenes, what did you think of the shots, like the scenery shots, the ones where you can see fields and fields in the background, the shots where you can see, no man's land and craters everywhere, when you see the river around, what do you think of all that scenery?
I think that Mendes and his cinematographer, Roger Deakins, I think that they're definitely using the setting to convey some messages throughout the film. Because you have almost two types of locations that they're in, right? And those are man-made and natural. And you see how in Ekust and in No Man's Land, two very man-made places, just in different ways, right? There's a lot of anxiety there. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of sort of uneven running around and dread as well. I think that in nature, you see a little more peace, a little more calm. That would be, for instance, the fields at the beginning and the end, the forest where the Devons are preparing, right, where they're singing that song. And then I think you also see at a couple of points the interplay between the two. What is a mostly natural place being touched by man, being subverted almost. So that would be like the farm, you know, very rural, pastoral, kind of idyllic, right? But then the plane crashes. It's on fire. It destroys the barn and it destroys, the brief moment of peace that they were able to have here when the German pilot stabs Blake. I think you also see that at the ending action sequence where the attack happens. There's a green field that's getting marred by all this white chalk, and then of course the shells that are coming in. So I definitely think that Mendes knew what he wanted to do with this setting in order to further his message.
Did it frustrate you as much as it did me when the officers just would not let him in?
Oh, absolutely. I have that in my review as the sort of ultimate obstacle, which is that, it isn't the Germans, it isn't nature trying to kill him, it isn't his own exhaustion after having marched and swam for over a day with, on no sleep. It's the fact that the bureaucrats in the military hierarchy don't want to admit him to the dugout.
Ugh.
Yeah.
And then even then, who was Mark Strong's character?
That is Captain Smith, and he is the commander of the convoy.
Yeah, okay, so even at that point, Captain Smith tells Schofield, make sure that there are witnesses when you talk to Mackenzie, because he's the type of individual that will not go with orders unless there are witnesses. Unless he's held accountable by multiple people. If you tell him one-on-one by yourselves, he'll have you locked up, and then he'll proceed with the battle. He'll pretend like he never got the orders.
Well, I believe that the line is that some men live for the fight. And to your point about saying, he'll just lock you up, he'll pretend he didn't see them, he directly tries to do that, not to lock Schofield up necessarily, but to say that, he doesn't care what's in the orders, and he's not going to wait. Because, and I think that, Benedict Cumberbatch is not in this movie very long, but Colonel Mackenzie is sort of talked about a little bit throughout the film. And I think that in the brief moments that you see him, you can gather a good bit about his character. That his face is scarred and seems to have happened in action, meaning that he's definitely seen, kind of the brunt of this war. He's not untouched or anything. He's not one of those officers that's out of touch or commanding from behind the lines. He's almost like Leslie's character earlier in the film, where he has a definite connection with his men. He's there with them every day. I think that he was tired of command failing him, essentially. I think that he wanted everything to be over with, almost.
Well, you did make a point. He says, right now, command is telling me not to attack. In 3 days, they'll say march forward, and more men will die.
Yeah, and he gives kind of a litany of things that he's been told before. He says, I'm not going to wait for rain or for fog or for... he gives a third thing, I think. But, so I think that sort of implies that command has been telling him, stop, start, for the previous 3 years of the war. I think that he's sort of tired of being failed in that way, because command is not at the line. He's very much inclined to believe that they don't know what they're talking about.
Well, I guess that's a little more relatable. And this is not to make it lighthearted. I think everyone can relate to that on some level when their supervisor tells them to do something. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. I've worked this post, or I've done this.
You don't know how anything works.
Yeah, you're a manager. I've been working here for the past 3 damn years in this same exact spot. I know what I'm doing. I know the best way to accomplish, the goal that you're setting for me. Your way is going to take longer. It's going to be more difficult. And it's going to be a bigger pain in the ass. Versus I don't know. I guess that's a little more relatable when you kind of talk about it in that aspect.
Although, to be fair, that is just kind of both of our natures. you said that you couldn't do a written critique of the film because you couldn't judge it. I mean, you know how judgmental I am. It wasn't a problem for me.
Oh God.
But and that's why I think that I made this point in the review that Mackenzie only actually listens to Schofield when he points out that he's walking into a trap. Because then it's more like the language of someone who knows what they're talking about. It's not, command has told you to wait for this arbitrary reason. It's, hey, you and I both know that the Imperial Germans are real bastards, and they would do something like this. And I know that you know that because we've both been fighting them in the same way. At that point, he kind of pauses, and then he listens.
That's a good point. I did not pick up on that my first or second time watching this movie. This film in 2019 was on a lot of top 10 lists, and it was number 1 for like the New York Post. But in your personal opinion, is it a top 10 film? Like, you don't have to say it's number 1, but would you consider it a top 10 film?
For 2019?
Yes.
Well, that's a harder question because it released in a limited run 2019, but then in in nationwide theaters 2020. And 2020 would be much easier to say because we're not seeing many new releases.
Unfortunately.
But,
God.
But for 2019, I believe yes. I believe that even in a year where you had, heavyweights like Endgame, or where you had really interesting, almost personal stories like Joker, I think that 1917 is definitely in that discussion. One thing that I'm kind of interested in is because, obviously you were paying more attention to the score. What's one portion of the film that you thought the score really kind of enhanced the effect or really brought your attention to it?
Very, very easily. The go-to, the point where I was like, holy crap, the score's amazing, was the scene at No Man's Land when he was running across to try and get to Mackenzie,
Mm-hmm.
and he's tripping over other soldiers and whatnot. And it's like the score just adds so much to the atmosphere that you can't take away from it. I don't know. To me, that scene, that and the scene where Blake dies are the two big standout scenes in this film. Like, they have like emotional weight to it, more than the baby, more than the milk, more than anything really, more than him choking out a German soldier. Is that
German had it coming though?
He did. Also, I wonder why he didn't kill the drunk one like real fast.
I think it just goes back to the fact that like he's scared and he didn't even really mean to kill the one. He was trying to just get him to, shush and leave it alone. But there you have it, I guess. One thing that I wanted to ask, especially since you bring it up, in the Battle of Acoust, or not the battle, but the chase in Acoust, there is a brief respite where he's able to, get into a cellar, and there's a French woman, Laurie, as well as a baby, I believe a baby girl. What did you think of that interlude?
I just thought it was a cute little piece of innocence in all the hell. Like, at first I was like, oh, like, her and her baby, refuge and whatnot. Especially when he gives her the milk that he had gotten from the cow earlier. I was really happy. And then I find out, it's not her child, that she found him, that she found the kid. And that kind of made me go from really like, oh, like a good innocence and like some calm, like in the middle of the storm, to, my heart. Because that child is more than likely an orphan now. That child will never know its parents. It will never know its real name. That kid will be named, Eric or, Jenna, whatever French name Frenchies have for French's sake. That kid will never know its past. And that just, I don't know, something about that added so much weight to the film.
I agree. I think that the film never lets you forget, even in kind of calm, sort of hopeful moments, where exactly these characters are and the circumstances that they're in. For instance, in the river, Schofield is floating peacefully for a bit after he gets through the riptides, and he bumps into corpses. Him and Blake are going into the farm. They see some nice cherry trees. They've all been chopped down, though, by the Germans. You have that very clean, very green field at the end that's being bombed out after the attack is called on. I think that even in these sort of lighter scenes, the ramifications of the war are always present.
Mhm.
In addition, that kind of leads into something else I wanted to ask you about, because the scene with the baby is, in my mind, foreshadowing for one of the reveals of the movie. When you were going through the first time, and Schofield would occasionally take that, tin case out of his breast pocket, out of like underneath his shirt, he would take it out and look at it for a second. What did you think of that? Did you think that had any significance?
No, definitely. I did think that it had some significance. I assumed very quickly that I knew it was family photos. It had to be letters from home or mementos from home. It had to be, you know. It's a common trope, and almost is doing it disservice, but it's fair to call it a trope
Mm-hmm.
that these characters, especially in war films, have something of home that they have with them. It's technically a World War II film, Captain America. What does he have? He has a compass that has Agent Carter's picture in it. Saving Private Ryan. Tom Hanks's character, he keeps the memories of his home with him. They ask him,
Right.
like, will you tell us stories about your wife? And he says, no, I don't think I will. He holds them to himself.
Right.
Um, God, off the top of my head, Fury was another one I remember where
Brad Pitt's character has the sweetheart grips on his pistol.
yes, exactly. These characters that keep a little piece of home with them, just so that way they can remember what home even is in these hard moments. With Schofield, I knew immediately the second like that tin came out and he kept tucking into his shirt. It was like, okay, that's the one.
Mhm.
Whatever's in there is the big thing, whether it's letters or pictures or mementos, whatever it is. That's where home is because it's right by his heart.
I agree. And the thing is, I actually missed that my first time around. When they're coming out of the trench that's just collapsed, and he's trying to get the dust out of his eyes because he's blind. First thing he does after clearing his face is whipping it out to see if he can still see the photos. He quickly tucks it back in. I hadn't thought of what that might be until the very end, where he takes it out, and he glimpses it, and they're of his wife and daughter. I hadn't even thought that Schofield was married. I hadn't considered his family. I knew that he was older than Blake. I knew that he was more of a veteran than Blake was, but I hadn't considered that the reason why he's so good with the baby is because he's probably sung that same lullaby to his own daughter. I hadn't considered that because he keeps, I guess, sort of that hope so close to him throughout the movie. He doesn't really talk about it.
Did you think that Schofield was so young that he didn't have a family? Because I kind of assumed the whole time that he has to have someone back home. Like, if he's going through all this hell, he has to have someone.
Well, I thought that he might have had someone, but I thought if he has family, it's going to be more like his parents. Or if he has someone back home, it would be like, a girl that he's seeing, not necessarily, that he's got a wife already and he's established with a small child. But that, of course, makes sense, just given that people married a lot younger in those days. And also, given that line that he has at the beginning when he and Blake are talking about leave, Blake mentions that his leave got canceled, I believe, and Schofield replies that it's easier just not to go back. And now we see exactly why, because he has to leave his wife and kid over again.
Did you find this film heavy? It buried an emotional toll. Did you find that or no?
Yeah, I mean, at moments, yeah, to be sure. I think that Mendes, some of his films are almost like Nolan films, where they have a sort of, not like robotic necessarily, but a colder feel, almost a more distanced feel. In this case, though, I thought that there were definitely emotional peaks there.
What to you, did anything in particular stand out as far as an emotional peak?
Well, definitely giving the news to the older Blake brother. I think that you can see on his face sort of the realization that transition from, my brother's with you, where is he? To understanding that, no, two of us were sent, only one made it. I think that you see all of that without, dialogue being said. I think that that's great. acting in that scene, that definitely had an emotional toll there, as well as, of course, the death.
All right, so final verdict. What'd you give it?
This might have been spoiled for anyone who read the review and anyone who also listened to earlier in the podcast, but I give it an A.
Fair. All right, you give it an A. I give it an IDK. I don't know. And it feels weird that we're starting off on a film that I don't really know how to rank. And thanks for joining us. If you'd like to hear more about our thoughts on movies, you can always go to therollback.net. I've been Eddie.
And I've been Alex.
And this was The Rollback.